Good evening, everybody. We call to order the Williamsport City Council meeting of Thursday, October 10th, 2019 at 7:30 p.m. in City Council chambers. Please rise for the invocation by Councilwoman Katz and remain standing for the flag salute.
Fall is here with the cooler weather and the beautiful changes of colors. Just like the changing of the colors, so are the many changes being talked about in City Hall and the city. As we go forward to make the best decisions for our city and its residents, Lord, we ask for your guidance in our choices. With that being said, I ask that we all be kind to one another, open our minds and hearts, and listen to all. Lord, please guide us in all that we ask for you tonight and in the future. Amen.
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 I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Mrs. Katz. We'll move to the approval of City Council minutes dated 9/26/19. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Second.
Motion and a second. Any comments, corrections, or anything else from council? If not, Mrs. Frank, please.
Mrs. Fosnok.
Yes.
Mr. Noviello.
Yes.
Mr. Henderson.
Yes.
Mrs. Katz.
Yes.
Mr. Slaughter.
Yes.
Mr. Allison.
Yes. Thank you, Mrs. Frank. Motion passes. Item 4, limited courtesy of the floor. We've had one request tonight, Bruce Huffman.
Good evening, Councilman Allison, members of council, members of the administration. My name is Bruce Huffman, 1000 Cherry Street. I'm talking regarding item 13, ordinance designating Lycoming College Boulevard. Some early history. Franklin Street was an original street in the Lloyd and Updegraff addition to the borough of Williamsport, dating back to at least 1850. As it does now, Franklin Street originally began at East 4th Street, but only ran north to Washington. It likely was named for Benjamin Franklin. Franklin Street is opposite the north end of Basin Street, a street which takes its name from a large water basin that once was adjacent to the west branch of the Pennsylvania Canal. This nearly 2-block-long basin where packet boats could dock and turn around was in the area of Panera Bread and the Basin Street Plaza. The opening of the canal in 1834 brought increased economic prosperity to Williamsport. Throughout their history, Franklin, East 4th, and Basin Street have always been public through streets. They are among 15 of the very first streets of Williamsport that still retain their original name. Some more recent history. In March of 2018, I opposed the renaming of Government Place on the grounds that it would erase part of the city's history and obliterate a unique and very rare name. At that time, I also asked council if it would create an ordinance that would lay out a thorough and transparent process for naming and renaming streets. 2 years ago, the proposed realignment of Franklin Street, coupled with the widening of Basin Street, was touted as a major improvement to the traffic patterns and vehicular safety in that area, especially at the intersection of East 4th Street. In addition, the reconstruction would provide better access between Lycoming College and I-180. Millions of dollars in public grant money was secured. In early September, Lycoming College asked to have the realigned part of Franklin Street renamed College Place in order to keep its existing 700 College Place address. Due to an issue with the block address numbering compliance as related to the new Kraft Gateway building, they have since asked for a private drive in front of the building to be named College Place. The college has now asked for the 1-block-long section of realigned Franklin Street to be renamed Lycoming College Boulevard. Some logic. Just as there is a process to obtain a zoning variance or undertake land development, there should be a thorough process to name or rename a street, one that provides guidelines and involves an opportunity for a public hearing. It has been said that since new construction was involved in creating the realigned part of Franklin Street, that it should be considered a new street without a name. Clearly, this is false thinking. You can simply look at item number 10, accepting a portion of Franklin Street and the accompanying deed of dedication to see that the city and the college both consider the realignment to be Franklin Street. In regard to renaming this realigned portion of Franklin Street, the Lycoming County Department of Public Safety has stated, quote, It could also be confusing to have the same stretch of road change names. The county's own public addressing ordinance 96-3 includes supplemental information on recommended road naming practices, one of which states, quote, if the road is continuous, do not change names at a curve or some point other than a road intersection. Most reasonable people would think that it is absurd to call a one-block section of a street a boulevard, especially when Williamsport's 4 existing boulevards range in length from 1/3 of a mile to nearly 1.5 miles long. Truth. At the Public Works meeting on Tuesday, it was stated by a member of the administration that the college's ultimate goal is not only to rename this one-block section of Franklin Street, but also to rename the entire length of Basin Street from East 4th to the 180 Beltway, and to petition PennDOT to change the exit name. In addition to inconveniencing people and businesses with a Basin Street address, this will completely erase one of the last remaining vestiges of Williamsport's canal transportation history. Apparently, the college believes that because it has made a financial contribution to the project, and because it has land abutting on 2 sides of a public street, that it has the right to ask for a street name change that benefits it, but destroys the historical and cultural fabric of the city. If you approve this ordinance, you are saying that having a transparent naming process that involves criteria, review, and citizen input does not matter. You are erasing a part of Williamsport's history, which will make it easier to obliterate the history of Basin Street in the near future. You are saying that any of the dozen or so entities or people that happen to own land on both sides of a public street in Williamsport are now justified in asking for a similar name change. If you approve this ordinance, you are saying that money, power, and politics is more important than history, logic, and truth.
Thank you, Mr. Huffman. We will now move to item 20. We're going to move that up in order to expedite that. Welcome, Mr. Girardi.
Yes. Good evening, President Allison and members of council. What you have before you is a certificate of appropriateness request to remove a portion of the southeast corner of the structure and replace it with exterior metal siding. The color of the exterior metal to match the existing brick, which is a brown. I have attached a drawing showing what the color of the metal siding is going to be. I also have attached a picture of what the building looks like from 3rd Street. I also have a picture of the area that's going to be done. I have attached a picture of what the material looks like, the color, and also a site plan of the overall size of this building. About a year ago, did a look at the facility. That wall and the back corner of the wall was condemned by myself because of the structural integrity of the wall itself, not the building. We went back through and looked at it. It's a metal structure, so this is almost like a veneer attached to it, but it's a large section of brick wall. So it needs to be replaced. London Construction went out and gave them a proposal, and that's why we're here today, is to try to get rid of the brick that's in the back of that building and put the metal, and I also have a picture of what it's going to look like when it's done. And if you have any questions of myself or the contractors, we are here if you have any questions.
Do we need a motion first? Is there a motion?
So moved.
Second. Motion and second. Comments or questions from council from Mr. Girardi?
So do we have any indication that at some time in the future they intend to encase the entire building in metal?
Not that I'm aware of, no. It's just this back portion because of the structural problem.
Thank you.
Mr. Henderson.
Does this comply with our ordinance?
As I interpret the design standards, you can use metal on a building as long as it's less than 50% of the building, which this isn't even close to being 50%. The other thing is this building was originally in the CS district, which is warehousing and so forth, which is a permitted use. Since the time of the condemnation and now, council voted on changing that to a central business district. Right. So that's why we're here in front of you.
Right.
But yes, it does meet, as I interpret the ordinance, it does meet the requirement of less than 50%.
Thank you.
This has been, that corner's been bad for quite some time.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been roped off for about, well, 8 months, almost a year, because it's, like I said, we're concerned about if it does come down, it's going to do some damage to vehicles in that parking lot.
Exactly. I may have missed it, Mr. Jardy. What was the height of the metal?
On the back wall, how
Yeah.
tall is it going to be? Randy? About 30? About 30 feet tall. That's the back portion. That's really the tallest portion of this. If you
Right.
notice, the ground starts out in its first floor, but then it slopes down as you go towards second. So it's a little bit higher in the back than it is in the front.
Mr. Girardi, why metal, not brick? Why not fix the brick?
Well, because it's going to be a lot more costly to do the brick than it would be the metal, number one. Other than that, that's all I can tell you. It would be, and it is a warehouse. It's not going to be anything else more than a warehouse as long as APR owns it. They're going to keep it as being a warehouse. Most warehouses are metal, but that's what their preference was, to use metal instead of brick. Now, if some developer buys the property and intends to switch it over and put in something different, then I think the design standards would change a little bit, and I think you would probably want to have windows and brick and so forth in that back area. But for them to use it as a warehouse, it's just not costly. It's not cost-effective for them.
And maybe the technical part, how does this support the structure?
This is attached to the structure that's going up. It's attached to the floor levels. It'll also be, they'll add purlins and so forth attached to the metal too. But that's how it is. It has a foundation underneath it. It comes up. It's attached to the bottom portion. Then it goes up to the first level. It's attached to the structure that goes around. And then it goes up to the roof level and it's attached to that.
Okay, and the section that has deteriorated, is that taken out, or is that,
Yes, that's going to be removed.
okay, that's removed, and then,
Yeah, that whole entire wall that you see that he's putting metal on, that's all going to be removed and taken down. You'll have an open structure, and then they're going to put the metal back up on
okay,
top.
all right,
Yep.
I got it now. Mr. Henderson?
Just one more, looking at the picture of that back corner there, I see the lines you've drawn down there. That indicates that that metal wall is going to be higher, is that correct, than what it is currently?
I have the architectural and structural drawings at the office. I can't answer that. I did not review it yet.
Oh, okay.
Is it going to be taller? It's going to be as tall as what's there now?
The parapet will be the same height as it is now on the east side.
Okay.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you. Yep.
I guess we're good. Mrs. Frank, on the motion, please.
Mrs. Fosna?
Yes.
Mr. Novello?
Yes.
Mr. Henderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Katz?
Yes.
Mr. Slaughter?
Yes.
Mr. Allison?
Yes, thank you, Mrs. Frank.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Motion passes. Thank you, Mr. Girardi. We're going to move to item 6. Then come back to 5 in a little bit. Mrs. Frank, in short form, please.
An ordinance vacating a portion of Franklin Street in the 8th Ward for the Lycoming College Multipurpose Building Campus Getaway.
Thank you, Mrs. Frank. Is there a motion?
So moved. Second.
And there's a motion and a second. This is the second reading, final reading of this ordinance. Mr. Benner.
Good
welcome.
evening, President Allison, members of council. There has been no changes to this ordinance since first reading. If you'd like me to read it again, I will do so.
No, I don't think you have to
Okay.
unless somebody, are we good with it? Mr. Henderson?
Just a question. Obviously, we need to do this, but I'm wondering, is there any reason for us to put any language in here that allows us the ability to access the property because of, say, stormwater or maybe other utilities that are under there? Is there anything that we need for that?
Unfortunately, you can't.
Oh, okay.
the vacation has to be an absolute.
Okay,
Generally, yeah,
okay,
I understand the utility lines, utilities have all been relocated.
okay.
That's usually a requirement with the property owner and the utilities to work
Okay.
something out when that have their own project areas.
That was my only question. I just want to make sure that we weren't stuck without the option to do what we have to do, so, good.
That was all done during land development, as far as that's all brought out when something you originally approved that, and all those were removed, so that was not an issue.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Hearing none, Mrs. Frank, please.
Mrs. Fosnot?
Yes.
Mr. Nubiallo?
Yes.
Mr. Henderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Katz?
Yes.
Mr. Slaughter?
Yes.
Mr. Allison?
Yes, motion passes. Thank you, Mrs. Frank. We're going to move to item 7 then. Mrs. Frank, in short form, please.
An ordinance vacation of a portion of DuBois Street.
This is a final reading as well. Is there a motion?
So move.
Second.
Motion and second. Anything new to offer on this, Mr. Benner?
Well, this has been gone over this past Tuesday pretty extensively at Public Works, and there was some lively discussion on this issue concerning another citizen, and from what I understand, that has been resolved to this point. And so, other than that, there is no other issues.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Benner. Mrs. Katz, Public Works.
Yes, we did discuss it at Public Works, and there was a citizen that was, had a discussion about this, but he took back, he's not rejecting this anymore. They came to an understanding, which I think is fine, and I think, we didn't pass this with a positive recommendation because of that. So therefore, because we thought we were going to have more of a
Right.
discussion tonight, but since the citizen chose not to reject this, there's no problem with this anymore.
Okay, thank you, Mrs. Katz. Any other comments? Mr. Henderson?
Just to say that we didn't actually vote on this. It was just a discussion in the Public Works, because this had already come to us, was given a positive
Okay.
vote, a month ago?
Right.
When it came for the first reading. And just to tag on there to what Mrs. Katz said, evidently there has been a resolution, and we're thankful for that. And so I don't see any reason why we shouldn't continue on.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Henderson. I think we're ready for the vote, Mrs. Frank.
Mrs. Fosnot?
Yes.
Mr. Noviello?
Yes.
Mr. Henderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Katz?
Yes.
Mr. Slaughter?
Yes.
Mr. Allison?
Yes, motion passes. Thank you, Mrs. Frank. Item 8 then, in short form, please.
An ordinance amending Article 902 of the city's codified ordinances related to brick paved streets and removing certain streets from those to be preserved under this ordinance.
Thank you, Mrs. Frank. Is there a motion?
So move.
Second?
Motion and second. Again, this is a final reading. Anything?
And
anyone-
likewise, no further changes or updates to this.
And this was reviewed in Public Works and everything's fine?
Everything's fine.
Mr. Noviello?
I know we've been trying to maintain our brick streets and as we should. This is only about maybe less than 50, 60 yards. Is that correct, Mr. Bennett?
That is true. It's like one city block, maybe.
And the remainder of that DuBois Street will remain in brick. We're not going to be affecting that in any way.
Say again?
We're not affecting the remainder of DuBois Street, which is in brick?
No, no.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll take the vote then. Mrs. Frank, please.
Mrs. Fosnot?
Yes.
Mr. Noviello?
Yes.
Mr. Henderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Katz?
Yes.
Mr. Slaughter?
Yes.
Mr. Allison?
Yes, motion passes. Thank you, Mrs. Frank. We will move down to item 10. Mrs. Frank, in short form, please.
An ordinance accepting a portion of Franklin Street located in the 8th Ward in the city of Williamsport.
Is there a motion?
So move.
Second.
Motion and a second. Mr. Benner?
Yes, and what you have in front of you is in fact an ordinance accepting the new portion of Franklin Street. This acceptance ordinance is necessary for the realignment of Franklin Street, which will serve as a grand entrance to the new Lycoming College multi-purpose building. The portion of land which is being accepted was previously owned by Lycoming College. This was reviewed at Public Works, and it was also reviewed by Mr. Lubin with minimal changes.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Benner. Mrs. Katz, Public Works.
Yes, this came to Public Works, and this, we did vote with a positive recommendation for this, knowing that what we have to do, it is part of the gateway, and as Mr. Benner said, this did go through Mr. Lubin, and so we saw no problem with this whatsoever.
Comments or questions from other council members? Seeing none, Mrs. Franklin, the vote, please.
Mrs. Fosna?
Yes.
Mr. Noviello?
Yes.
Mr. Henderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Katz?
Yes.
Mr. Slaughter?
Yes.
Mr. Allison?
Yes, motion passes. Thank you, Mrs. Frank. Item 11, in short form, please.
An ordinance renaming College Place to Warrior Way.
Is there a motion?
So moved.
Second.
Motion and a second. Mr. Winder, welcome.
Good evening. This is an ordinance renaming the current College Place, which is in the center of Lycoming College. It is a private-owned street by Lycoming College, currently named College Place. It heads from Washington Boulevard southward to a dead-end cul-de-sac on their property. Lycoming College had requested to have this renamed to Warrior Way. And with your information on this, you'll see where the recommendation actually came from Lycoming County Department of Public Safety. In conjunction with the next ordinance I'm going to read. If you have any further questions, I'm more than happy to answer them.
Thank you, Mr. Winder. Mrs. Katz?
Yes, this came to Public Works, and we really had a long discussion about these streets being named. Mr. Winder did talk to the post office, the county, everybody that was involved with this to make sure that the addresses wouldn't be changed, that they would use it at one, what was it, one?
Right, the next ordinance will name it as One College Place. The city will actually name the new section of roadway in front of the Craft Center, which is privately owned by the college, to College Place, and then the Department of Public Safety would actually give them the numerical section of the address as number 1. The post office would then work with them to transition their mail to that without the college having to change every mailer they have or anything of that nature.
We more or less were discussing both of these streets at the
Exactly.
same time.
Yeah.
One of the there have been a couple of changes, though, in the ordinance. You did get a new sheet that was handed out. What was changed was, on the second line, we wanted it to say, the new private drive in front of the, oh, I have the wrong one. That we wanted it to say, starting, that it was hereby designated as Warrior Way, not also. Take out the also, okay? It says, on the old ordinance, what it said was also be hereafter designated as College Place, Warrior Way. We wanted to take out also. We just thought that was a confusing
Okay.
word, okay? The other thing that we, and this came from Mr. Hoffman, where the streets themselves were not correct, if I'm saying this correctly, that the private street now designated as College Place starting at Washington Boulevard, extending southward to the southern terminus be hereby designated.
The previous wording had it between Washington Boulevard and East 4th Street, which
Right.
technically it is between those 2 points. It just does not end at East 4th Street.
Right. Okay,
We
So
just
just
wanted to
cleaning up a little bit of
clarify that.
language on the ordinance itself.
I
great.
just wanted to, I was mixing up my two ordinances here. I mean, all these with this. But
Totally
that's what
understandable.
we changed that, so it would be clarified of where these
Yes.
streets were. And so the new handout is the one that was handed to us, is the correct ordinance.
Okay,
Did
great.
we have to, do we have to do anything with that? We should amend?
Because what was presented and approved on, or at least the motion,
Okay.
or just
This is first.
This is the first read, this is the first reading. This just came to the committee.
what was presented to city council.
Okay. So we should amend this then, make a motion to amend what was in the ordinance to begin with on the streets.
Okay, we're amending from
Warrior Way.
and to.
I think a little more clarification for Norm. Norm, when they met at Public Works, they had an issue with the wording. I redid the wording in the ordinance to what they expected, and it was delivered to them early this morning. So they're actually reading the amended ordinance.
Then there's no need for amendment.
It's already been
There's no
amended.
need to
then.
do that.
And this is first reading.
You're voting on the amended
So we're
ordinance
good
that
to go.
never came before council before.
Right,
Okay,
yeah, this is the first, yes.
all right.
Just wanted to clarify that,
Yeah,
because this really got confusing, I'm gonna,
Well-
it really did.
and to an extent, it still is, but I think.
Seriously.
I think we're on the right track. Mr. Henderson?
Just to clarify as much as we can, this came at the request of Lycoming College because they wanted to take the name College Place to another location. So we can't have two college places in the city. So this is simply redesignated what was College Place to Warrior Way, so that now we can use College Place at another location where the new building stands. And so that's simply all this is. This is while there is public access, it is a vacated street, and it's right down the center of the campus. And I find it appropriate to name it Warrior Way. We want to be a help to Lycoming College. We'd rather not be a hindrance to them. There'd be a lot of printing costs. So this is a part of that solution to be a help to Lycoming College, which we want to do. So just that clarification there. And so all we're doing here is just redesignating Warrior Way. The original word that we had in there, the also, kind of gave the impression that it would have two names, College Place and Warrior Way. So that's why the confusion earlier. But now to clarify that, there is no also, and there's just going to be Warrior Way, that's it.
Great.
Should this be approved in both readings. Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions or comments? Hearing none. Mrs. Frank on the motion, please.
Mrs. Fosna?
Yes.
Mr. Noviello?
Yes.
Mr. Henderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Katz?
Yes.
Mr. Slaughter?
Yes.
Mr. Allison?
Yes, motion passes. Thank you, Mrs. Frank. We will proceed to item 13.
We didn't do 12.
Oh, okay. Now I'm confused. Item 12, in short form, please.
An ordinance designating College Place.
Is there a motion?
Second.
Motion and a second. Mr. Winder?
So the front of the craft center would be a private drive. Lycoming College is requesting to name that College Place. As I said, the Lycoming County Department of Public Safety came up with the suggestion of naming that area right there. It would match up with their numbering system, and Lycoming College would be able to use the number 1 College Place, which everyone felt was a lot more suitable and a lot easier to get done. This did go in front of Public Works and was passed with a positive recommendation.
Thank you, Mr. Winder. Mrs. Katz?
Same thing.
Yeah.
Same thing, it's on the college
This is
property.
a continuance of the
It's a
same
conti-
issue.
Exactly, exactly.
Mr. Henderson.
I might just add, I think this is an excellent example of when the players get together, they can come to a viable solution and help everybody out. The college needed some help, and so there was a meeting, and this was the result. I think it's a good solution, and everybody involved is agreeable to this. So I just think it's a great example. So I want to thank Mr. Winder for taking part in those discussions and making sure that we can accommodate the college in this way. So I'm very thankful for this, and I support it wholeheartedly.
Thank you. Other comments? Hearing none, on the motion, Mrs. Frank, please.
Mrs. Fosnack?
Yes.
Mr. Noviello?
Yes.
Mr. Henderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Katz?
Yes.
Mr. Slaughter?
Yes.
Mr. Allison?
Yes, motion passes. Thank you, Mrs. Frank. And now item 13.
An ordinance designating Lycoming College Boulevard.
Is there a motion?
So move.
Motion and a second. Mr. Winder.
This is the final ordinance for Lycoming College at this time, designating the realigned section of roadway between Franklin Street and Basin Street, connecting at East 4th Street. Once again, the Department of Public Safety made a suggestion in the letter that you all received to accommodate the college in some fashion with an idea on how to rename that, or name that section to be suitable for Lycoming College's dreams of what they want. As it was stated, Lycoming College, their overall goal is to rename the entire stretch of Basin Street from Route 180 north to connect to this. The reasoning was, if you were able to come up Basin Street heading north right now, and you were looking at the new craft center, each side of the opening for that new section of roadway has a brick wall there, which would give you the image that you are entering college property. This was read in front of Public Works and passed with a negative recommendation.
Thank you, Mr. Winder. Mrs. Katz.
We just had, yes, this just come to Public Works. We had difficulty with this because when you're looking at the street, you're really dealing with three different names. You're dealing with Basin Street, College Place, and then Franklin Street. And we thought that was just very confusing to do that. And we really thought we should have a discussion with the full body of council on what they all felt about this, because if what they want to do in the end is to have the street, the whole name changed from really the river all the way up, then why are we going through this process right now? Of course, Mr. Winder said maybe this is the start of something. I don't know. I think I really wanted to have the discussion with the full body of council on this, because having one street in such a short, what is it, a mile, if that? If that, with three different names is just very, very confusing to anybody that's coming into our city. So I think we should discuss it.
Well, let's discuss. Mrs.
How
Foster.
many people are affected by the change of addresses in that area?
From East Edwin Street south to East 4th Street, none. And then if you were to go from East 4th Street south on Basin Street to 3rd Street, none. The most people affected would be between 3rd Street and Via Bella Street.
Which is how many?
If I had to guess,
Two,
half
three?
a dozen tops.
So why not put the new name all the way from the river up to the college now? Why piecemeal it?
I am not 100% sure why. I mean, in my mind, what I put together was you have essentially a new roadway. I understand in some minds you're moving Franklin Street in my mind, you're placing a road where there wasn't a road before. So therefore, personally speaking, I think from the highway all the way to Grampian Boulevard, the road should be named the same. I mean, if we're going to have a discussion back and forth on, you know, having streets line up and being the same name and whatnot, regardless of a curve, you now realign Basin Street with what everyone is calling Franklin Street, so you still have two different names coming together.
But that would affect a lot of people.
I don't disagree.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Henderson?
The original letter that we received from the college on September 6th, expressing their interest to change that portion originally to College Place. When they approached the county about the address, the county said that's not going to work. Our Streets and Parks Director and others got together in the room and they found a solution to meet the needs as voiced in the letter, the original letter that we have. Since that time, now the college has come to us with a desire to change that roadway again. The question is, why? And we understand, because it would be nice, it would look great coming in, and it would be a grand entrance and all of that. That's fine, but it doesn't match up with the original reason that they gave us. And to me, I feel like that's somewhat disingenuous. I want to support the college, and I'm very thankful for all that the college is doing. But I also want to preserve the history of the city as well. I think this decision should be vetted better. Right now, in the Historic Preservation Committee, there is legislation being put together with regards to naming public streets. And it is, I would say, 75% complete. My goal would be to have that complete and before council, before my term is ended. That ordinance has a great process lined out so that the city has a say in what their street name is. And there would be a process for a public hearing and such, and I think it would be helpful in this case for something like that. And I think it would also be helpful to the administration that they would have some guidelines to guide them through this process. So for that reason, I would love to see us delay this till there is a better instructions laid out, and we're able to vet this decision better. This is a through street, and so this would be a big change. Perhaps the best solution is what was originally recommended by the Lycoming County Department of Public Safety. And what they suggested is that portion of Franklin Street have an alias, an honorary name, if you will. In fact, we could give an honorary name to all of Basin, all the way up through the entranceway, Lycoming College Boulevard. Wouldn't that be a workable solution? Without losing the permanent name of Basin Street, give an honorary designation because we want to honor the college. But at the same time, we don't want to lose the history that we have. So that would be my recommendation down the road, perhaps. But as this ordinance stands here, I cannot vote for this in a positive manner, the way that it stands. And so that's my 2 cents in the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Henderson. Mr. Slaughter?
I'm with Councilwoman Falls Knot, maybe we could have the discussion about not just piecemealing it, but the larger discussion, we can include Councilman Henderson's, what he just stated as well, and maybe have the conversation with the college that we don't piecemeal it, either we do it, we don't do it, we do an honorary. So I think there's just more discussion needed around this. I agree, it doesn't make any sense to just do one little small section, you have Basin Street, and then this, and then Franklin. It would make more sense in my mind, either we do it all, or we do an honorary, or whatever the case might be. But I think, you know, they came together not long ago and had a conversation and worked out a solution. I think we could do that again here. So that's what, you know, I'm in agreement with both of that, basically, that there's just more conversation needed to come up with a sensible solution here.
Right. What I'm hearing is we want to have a discussion with the college. I think it's the consensus. To deal with this right now, would you prefer to table it?
I think we should table it so we can have the discussion. Since this is, the street itself has turned into be very confusing.
Right.
And I think we have to come up with some kind of solution, since we've already gone the other route. We want to honor the college. We want to make sure that, you know, they're front and center with what they're doing. But we also want to make it, the street itself, when you have visitors coming into your city, you don't want them to think that they're just going into the college, that's not a through street. So we've got to come up with a solution that it's going to look like the college, but you're also getting into the city also. So therefore, we have to come up with some kind of solution, which at Public Works, we could not come up with a solution. We wanted to have more of a discussion.
I think what we're seeing is common problems when you're dealing with an older city. Newer developments are laid out and everything's nice and square and the streets go this way and that way. But we're dealing with 200 years of more of development. So of older development that we're trying to accommodate new development, and there's going to be bumps and turns along the way that we're going to have to work our way through. I think especially in the Gateway area, we've focused on that because it was considered a brownfield, underdeveloped. It was designated that. Now the federal government's designated it as an opportunity zone. It's ripe for changes, and we're probably going to meet some more of these down the road. We do need a vehicle to address those kinds of things, because we don't want to go block by block down East 4th Street through the Gateway trying to figure out what we're going to do.
I also think that the idea of an entrance off of 81 that designates its college, its way to get to the college, is very important. If any of us have
It is.
traveled, we need that kind of exit that tells you a destination that you need to go to. And I think that's just user-friendly for our visitors and people that come to our community. And we should make it easy for them to find places of significance within the city.
Mr. Henderson?
I think, if I'm not mistaken, there is a sign on the highway before the Basin Street exit that indicates Lycoming College. And so that's good, you know, and that's what we want. That will be the main entrance. We need people to know exactly where they're going. I think an honorary designation would help with that. I think we also have to remember we are accommodating the college quite a bit already. Not that I'm saying we shouldn't do more to help, but to, you know, move around College Place and all that. And I understand it's their private drive in that sense, and you know, I'm excited to be able to accommodate and help them with that. I think it's important. And so, yeah, I think it's important for us to walk down this road carefully, with much thought, but we want to do it well, and help on all sides here. So, that's it.
Thank you, Mr. Henderson. Other comments on this item. I think, oh, Mrs. Katz.
When this started, I mean, we wanted to see that stretch of road two-way for how many years?
Yes.
And now to have that accomplished, I mean, it's fantastic. Also to have the entrance to the college there is also fantastic. But again, we want to do it correctly. It's like when Penn College did theirs. I mean, that, if you want to call it their gateway, is absolutely terrific. I mean, but they're not going into, their gateway doesn't go into city streets. It goes right into their college, where this street is going through our city streets. So therefore, we have a little bit more of a complication here, but we also want to acknowledge, just like Penn College has their gateway, we want Lycoming College to have their gateway, I mean, to look as fantastic.
Right.
So, again, I go back to how, if you're traveling through our city and you're new to the city, you want to make it very accommodating, not confuse somebody. And so we do have to be careful how we do this. So maybe there is a solution, but we, you know, I think it's just a lot more discussion.
Yes. So was there a motion to table?
Could I just, the other option would be just to vote this down and allow them, allow the discussion and just come back with a new ordinance. You know, I mean, that's one option too. We could set it on the table, but it'll have to be amended when we pick it up. So we could just vote what's before us down, and then draft a new one.
You could.
I mean, it's just a matter.
My thought was, some of council has been deeply involved in this whole issue, and some of us haven't. So it was important that we have this discussion all together.
I agree.
And I thought maybe, you know, to
Either
table
case, I just thought it might be a simpler way rather than having to amend once we pick it up off the table again. Because what we pick up
Right.
is exactly what we're putting down.
I would say that as long as the understanding is we're going to have a discussion with the college, because to vote it down, you know, is a finality that kind of shuts the door and leaves less room for discussion.
Understand?
In some ways.
It would be, Randy?
Nobody's made a motion yet. Yes?
It would be, I understand where you're coming from, Joel, and I think that maybe makes the situation a little clearer, but I think that the message would be too final for me. I would make a motion that we table the item. I've discussed it with Dr. Trachte and Mr. Edmonds, and I think the college is perhaps in the long run in need of a little bit of guidance about the renaming process within the city, which doesn't currently exist. And so in our discussions, I said, well, you know, Mr. Henderson is working on a renaming ordinance, but it's not quite there yet. It's possible that this is something that will be, you know, that someone will feel strongly that we should wait on this until we have that in place, so we have a mechanism for reviewing the change of the name. And they seem to understand that, to be cognizant of it, and to be okay with it conceptually. I didn't follow up with them I discussed with them what had been recommended by 911, but didn't follow up with them in terms of my thoughts about whether or not we were going to table this one, but I figured we probably would. And, so I think they're comfortable with it. I think they understand the concept of, you know, perhaps waiting until we wrap our heads a little further around what we want to do in terms of naming, a procedure for naming parcels within the city, and then going through that procedure and using that as a vetting process. I think that we perhaps at the same time should be aware that they're looking for a way to designate their entrance, and if a couple of us perhaps approach them and try and figure out exactly what that looks like, then that is probably the best way to do it, to talk to the college offline and then bring the item back when we have a better idea what the process is.
I second your motion.
Okay. Sorry, I made the motion too early.
You made that motion, I heard it.
We have a motion to table in the second. Mayor Campbell.
Good evening, Mr. President, members of City Council. I concur with what Ms. Mealy is saying. I think it would be a mistake for us to actually vote against it. My position would be if council could table it, because I'm going to use a term that Mrs. Katz's been saying several times tonight. This has been a fantastic project with so many partners, and I think that we would be really would make a mistake by saying no. We would create a negative connotation on this project. So my recommendation would be if council, if you're not ready to vote on this tonight in the affirmative, that you table it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Campbell. So we have a motion to table in the second. If there's no other discussion. Oh, Mr. Henderson.
I'll just say, I concur. You know, I was not thinking of the connotation, and I appreciate that comment. I appreciate the comments of the members of council, because it is something worth pursuing. We want to pursue it. I was just looking for simplifying the process, but wasn't thinking. So thank you, Mr. Mayor. I agree.
Okay.
I
Thank
agree.
you.
Thank you.
Mrs. Frank, on the motion, please, to table.
Mrs. Fosna?
Yes.
Mr. Novello?
Yes.
Mr. Henderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Katz?
Yes.
Mr. Slaughter?
Yes.
Ms. Mealy?
Yes.
Mr. Allison?
Yes, motion is to table is passed. Thank you, Mrs. Frank. I've been asked to move item 19, Land Development Water Tower Square up, so we'll do that. Please. Mrs. Frank, please. Oh, we don't, I'm sorry, we don't need you to read it.
Oh, Randy, that's not very nice. I figured, but I wasn't sure, so.
Mr. Nar, welcome.
Good evening, President Allison and members of council. What I present to you tonight is a land development request by Water Tower Squares LLC. It is located at 1000 Commerce Park Drive. It is currently in the ML zoning district. That currently obviously has a multi-use facility there now. What they're looking at doing is adding a proposed construction of a 5,000 square foot warehouse in addition to 19 storage units. Both of these will be an accessory use to the permitted use that's there. It was reviewed by Lycoming County Planning Commission as well as the city's Planning Commission. We have since talked with the developer. We are requiring them to basically, obviously there'll be a new set of prints that will be just done up for the actual when we have it recorded. So there'll be a change in the ML that will identify the ML. The other thing too is the owner has agreed that we will require them to provide an access, a one-way in access, one-way out as far as the markings. So we will be providing a new drawing at final, providing council approves this land development this evening. The other concern with the note is with the landscape in reference to that. Based off of where it's located at, if you notice there's a retaining wall right there currently now by the highway. You will not see that parking lot. It will meet the 10% as far as to have the green space in addition to the buffer space and everything. You just won't be able to see that. They currently have a retaining wall that's there that does have some shrubbery. They're just going to extend that down. So they will meet the ordinance as far as landscape. And again, it was reviewed by both planning and county planning as well with a positive recommendation. And I can answer any questions, and we do have a representative here.
Thank you, Mr. Nar. Questions or comments from council?
The only comment would be, have we addressed those comments with the county, and were they satisfied? That is to say, your explanations of the comments, they were satisfied?
Correct.
with those?
At our planning commission meeting, when we reviewed it, they agreed to those terms to basically correct those. It's just what will happen is providing that the city council approves them, then the new plans will be drawn up, will show those corrections on there.
Right. No, I was actually asking specifically the county planning department. Did we talk to them about our perspective on the retaining wall and the screening and all that.
Yes, I did have a
And they brought that-
conversation with them,
okay,
correct.
all right. Just wanted to make certain that we all come to agreement there. All right, thank you.
Mrs. Fosna.
What color will it be?
What color will it be?
Yeah.
Matt?
Matt Fricker, Larson Design Group. I'm not 100% sure. I'm guessing a maroon red color, kind of like Joe's sweater maybe.
So it will blend in with that community that's
Correct.
there.
It would be similar to the brick color of the.
I wouldn't want it to be like bright yellow or orange or anything like that.
It will not stand out.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Hearing none, is there a motion?
So move.
Motion and second. Mrs. Frank?
Mrs. Posner?
Yes.
Mr. Noviello?
Yes.
Mr. Henderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Katz?
Yes.
Mr. Slaughter?
Yes.
Ms. Mealy?
Yes.
Mr. Allison?
Yes, motion passes. Thank you, Mrs. Frank. We will go back up to, all the way up to item 5. In short form, please, Mrs. Frank.
An ordinance adopting a 6-year capital budget project budget for the city of Williamsport for fiscal years ending June 30th, 2020 to June 30th, 2025.
Okay, we need a motion to remove this from the table.
So moved.
Second.
Motion and second, it's off the table and back on the agenda.
Good evening.
Mr. Nichols, welcome.
President Allison, Vice President Mealy, members of council. Again, this ordinance is trying to adopt the city's proposed 6-year capital program for the city of Williamsport on second reading. Again, this document serves a planning tool for the city with the first 2 years structured more or less as the action plan. Last Monday, we reviewed this program with the Williamsport Planning Commission, which provided a positive recommendation to the whole body of council. We also talked about it again at the Finance Committee this week, and the total 6-year capital program is approximately $97 million, and so we're asking your approval on second reading. I know that Councilwoman Mealy has some changes I think she would like to introduce as it relates to IT technology for City Council. And the other thing I just want to mention is on the Gateway project, just a couple comments on that. I think that, I don't think we should take a piecemeal approach to naming. If you haven't been up there, it's quite a transformation. If you look at Basin Street in Franklin, it's really unbelievable, and I think every city official should be very proud of what we've been able to do up there. So I think that, it is now a grand entrance, so it deserves something more than just, I think, what was there before. But the history, obviously, of the area is very important. And the other thing I want to say is that as part of this project, there's components always very important, more than just the major infrastructure improvements. That's signage, wayfinding, signage. And, there's been a lot of talk, and we really haven't talked about it recently, but I know we've had discussions with the college about branding that old city and period signage maybe, and I think that's also part of what we need to do on Franklin and Basin Street. And I think obviously we want to work with the college and make signage that's appropriate for what they've done, but I don't think we need to lose sight of what the city has done. We're talking about a $7 million investment in the Gateway project, so I think signage, and at the end of the day, whatever signage we agree upon in terms of Basin, Franklin, whatever needs to recognize the city's investment, and the taxpayers' investment, and what we've been able to support in terms of what the college in that area needs and deserves. So those are just my comments. But wayfinding, I think council, whether it be public works or whatever, I think we're now ready to talk about not only signage and naming of streets, but the overall wayfinding planning process that needs to take place. So those are my comments, for
Okay.
whatever it's worth.
Thank you, Mr. Nichols. Mrs. Frank, we made a motion and a second to remove from the table, so we need to vote on that, so.
Mrs. Posner?
Yes.
Mr. Noviello?
Yes.
Mr. Henderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Katz?
Yes.
Mr. Slaughter?
Yes.
Ms. Mealy?
Yes.
Mr. Allison?
Yes, motion passes. Thank you, Mrs. Frank. It was.
So should I start over?
In short form, please, Mr. Nichols.
We discussed this briefly at Finance, but decided that I don't believe that we forwarded it with any recommendation whatsoever. I can't recall.
No, we did not.
Basically, we said, did it come back from the planning commission with a positive recommendation? All right, then. And then I said, hey, Joe and Chris, would you figure out what I should add to the capital budget to help council go digital sometime in the next 5 years? And they were kind enough to do that for me without me even having to ask another time, because I would have forgotten. So thank you, Joe and Chris. And so I can say really quickly that I do have one minor amendment that I would propose to the capital budget, which is an additional line under general government for, what do we want to call it, digital innovation?
21st century thinking.
20th century. Anyway, council, let's say council packet digitization. And the funding source for that item, my proposal, but I'm open to suggestions, would be that something like that should come from the general fund in the same way that paper and all of the other supplies that currently go into our packets come from the general fund. And the lines proposed by Mr. Pavlak and Mr. Cooley, as we well know, sometimes get argued back, but the suggestion was that in this coming year, in between, prior to the next city council election 2 years from now, we put in $14,000 in fiscal year 2020, 2021 to purchase the mobile workstations, that is to say tablets of some description for city council, and develop a framework for managing packets electronically instead of managing them on paper. 2021, 2022, we put $5,000 in to purchase a mobile workstation for the city clerk and put something mobile at the presenter's desk as well that includes a projector, so that we don't have all this sort of random tech laying around. And then 2023, 2024, Mr. Pavlak and Mr. Cooley, obviously we'd have to see how this plays out, period. We're of the opinion that we might want to get into the habit of replacing workstations with each new batch of council members. That is to say that because technology has a relatively short lifespan, we may want to figure that we'll be replacing them every 4 years, and then if we're fortunate enough to be able to continue using them for another 4 years, we let it go. So the worst case scenario then was 2023, 2024, another $8,000 for a new set of workstations for newly elected or re-elected council members, and 2025, 2026, the same. $6,000 to purchase workstations for the next set of newly elected council members. As we all know, this budget is a wish list. We say that every year when we look at it. And me inserting these particular spending, me requesting that City Council insert these particular spending items in the budget does not in any way, shape, or form mean that it will happen. It will depend very much on the budget that we see in November and the impact that it will have on city government operations and the taxpayers in the city. That said, I believe, it seems to me that last year when I did the calculations of how much we spent on office supplies in City Hall, we were somewhere around $50,000, $60,000 in the city as a whole. If we can begin to reduce that number, I think perhaps we can realize the sort of savings that make it worth the investment in items like this. So that's something for us to look at, but I do think that we need to look at moving into the 21st century in terms of how we handle things like huge stacks of paper, how we file, how, I know all of us have filing cabinets full of material at home. Joel, you're probably looking forward to getting rid of yours. So I would make a motion that we, as I said, insert a line item for council packet digitization under the general government tab on page 3 of the capital budget. And then in general fund as the funding source in fiscal year 2020, 2021, $14,000, fiscal year 2021, 2022, $5,000, fiscal year 2023, 2024, $8,000, and that'll take us out to the end of the recommendations.
That's a total of 27,000, I'm right?
Thank you very much, and yes, that is a total of 27,000. Thank you.
You're welcome. You made a motion, is there a second?
Second.
There's a motion and a second. Any discussion on those changes? I think we're all on board with that. We'll vote on the amendment then. Mrs. Frank, please.
Mrs. Fosna?
Yes.
Mr. Noviello?
Yes.
Mr. Henderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Katz?
Yes.
Mr. Slaughter?
Yes.
Ms. Mealy?
Yes.
Mr. Allison?
Yes, the motion on the amendment passes. Thank you, Mrs. Frank. And we can now do the final reading, I believe. And I think, are we good to go there? Any other? Okay, Mrs. Frank, please.
Mrs. Fosna?
Yes.
Mr. Noviello?
Yes.
Mr. Henderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Katz?
Yes.
Mr. Slaughter?
Yes.
Ms. Mealy?
Yes.
Mr. Allison?
Yes, thank you, Mrs. Frank. Motion passes. We'll go down to item 9 then. In short form, please, Mrs. Frank.
An ordinance of the City of Williamsport, Lycoming County, Pennsylvania, authorizing and securing the issuance of a general obligation note in the maximum principal amount of $2 million pursuant to the Pennsylvania Local Government Unit Debt Act as interim and permanent financing to construct improvements to city streets and recreation facilities, Bowman Field, River Valley Transit Infrastructure, and Grappius Run stormwater management, bus purchases, and paving-related expenses, accepting a bank loan proposal to purchase the note, setting forth the terms and substantial form of the note, creating a sinking fund and appointing a sinking fund depository for the note, pledging the full faith, credit, and taxing power of the city to secure the note, and authorizing related actions and documents.
I'm glad we asked for the short form. I know. Thank you, Mrs. Frank. Is there a motion?
So moved. Second.
Motion and a second. Mr. Nichols.
Thank you again. This ordinance in front of you approves a proposal from CNI Bank for this 2-year line of credit and a subsequent term provision, if needed, at a really desirable rate, fixed rate of 2.978%. This line of credit replaces interim financing, which recently expired and needs to be renewed as required by the city's RACB grants and other PennDOT grants in place for the East 3rd Street Gateway Project and Bowman Field. Included in my memo is the proposal from the bank, as well as a recommendation from Delta Development as to the level of interim financing needed for the city's ongoing reimbursement-type projects. Key provisions of the bank financing, besides the great rate, is that there's no prepayment penalty related to the term provision. Also, the line of credit can be used not only for current projects, but also proposed projects, such as the Memorial Park Improvement Project. That looks very favorable. Stormwater improvements, including Grappius Run and RVT-related projects. Jens Umgaard, our bond counsel, was at the Finance Committee meeting to review the document. As a result of that meeting, you received an updated document reflecting the committee's recommended changes to improve the legislative intent of the ordinance. Specifically, there is language related to the line of credit for the Bowman Field project, stating that it is only for RACB reimbursements only. Also, any new RVT projects contemplated under this ordinance must have prior approval of council. I think that's a good addition, simply because right now there is no approved projects in place. We're pursuing things, but nothing's in place at this point in time. And also, we reviewed the language requiring council approval if there is a desire to utilize a term provision at the end of the interim financing period, and we reviewed that in depth. I want to thank CNN Bank and Jens Umgaard for structuring this financing document to allow the decision makers over the next 2 years to take advantage of this low interest rate, because it is locked in for the line of credit term, as well as if there's a utilization of the fixed term, and also the flexibility in the document to have financing in place for future high priority projects if they come about. So it gives, again, flexibility for decision makers over the next 2 years to deal with issues as they come about, and council can make decisions accordingly. So with that, I'll defer back to the chair.
Thank you, Mr. Nichols. This was reviewed in finance.
It was reviewed by the Finance Committee, and we had a number of questions, and as Mr. Nichols noted, we did make some recommendations. Just to look at a couple of the basics, as I think most of us on council are aware, 'cause most of us have been through one issue, one borrowing or another. The items that are included in the title, that lengthy bit that Janice just read out, and it must have been really difficult, Janice, because that all caps is hard. Anything that can be included or visualized under that wording is something that we could potentially utilize this money for. There are a handful of things you might notice about that. One is that it doesn't say exclusively reimbursable grant-related expenditures, which is to say that it is possible for us, the reason that it is necessary for us to take out a line of credit right now is that we have multiple grants that we have accepted in the city that require us to spend the money and then get reimbursed for it. And the city does not have the $2 or $3 million in cash flow that we would need to have in order to flex that out of the general fund and flex it back in. In fact, our general fund balance generally sits at somewhere under $1 million right now, I believe. So we need to have a line of credit in place to deal with those reimbursable grant costs that we will be seeing. And we are fortunate, my understanding from Mr. Nichols is that some of the grants that we've received on East 3rd Street will even permit us to pay a portion of the interest related to this particular loan, because we are paying interest on having received that money the entire time we have the loan open. So we'll be able to pay a portion of the interest from the grants on East 3rd Street, potentially. That said, the little Pandora's box that we're opening here is that we are not borrowing this money exclusively for reimbursement, at least as the administration has visualized it right now. We are potentially borrowing this money, and including in the wording here in the title, the ability to utilize it for things that are not reimbursable. That is to say, to put the city another $2 million into debt. And if we were to do that, then the lovely schedule at the back of our original packet that shows that we're paying back several $100,000 a year after the beginning of 2022, $231,000 a year to be precise for the next 10 years, goes into effect. And so if we do utilize the $2 million in borrowing that it is possible for us to utilize this with this ordinance, we're going to be paying a total of about $434,000 in interest between now and 2031. Clearly, we should think very hard then about whether or not we actually want to keep any of that money out of the bank. But some of the difficulty, I think, in this particular item is that there isn't necessarily a way for us to trigger a notification of City Council if we are spending money towards something that we will not be reimbursed for. And I don't know that there is necessarily a way to put that in here. Mr. Nichols did put in, even before our discussions on Tuesday, we have the codicil that says that at least 30 days prior to the end of the drawdown period, the council of this city shall advise the director of finance of the amount of the then outstanding balance of the note that shall be retired by the end of the drawdown period from other available funds. However, we have a number of possibilities there. One is that if we've already authorized spending beyond the reimbursable costs, then we won't be able to retire all the debt and it's not going to matter because we will have already spent the money. The other possibility, of course, is that reimbursements don't always happen quite as quickly as we'd hope. For instance, our current short-term loan that we take out every year in the city, the TRAN, the tax anticipation note, is we have $651,000 on it that we carried over from our last line of credit that will be immediately being drawn down from this line of credit because we have not yet been reimbursed for that debt. So, we may or may not be able to retire the entirety of the debt at the end of the drawdown period, one way or the other. It's a lot of moving parts. It is something we need to do, but the Finance Committee made a handful of recommendations to try and limit our exposure without the knowledge of ourselves or future councils or the administration that we are committing ourselves to debt that we don't intend to. But I would be open to suggestions from other members of council if you've had a chance to review or observations related to if there are other ways that we can limit our exposure to make certain that we don't spend into that we don't utilize funds from this borrowing without our knowledge, that we don't spend ourselves into debt. Finance Committee did add the clause, asked Mr. Nichols to add, and he added, excuse me, on page 3, any expenditures of no proceeds to finance River Valley Transit infrastructure improvements or bus purchases shall be subject to the specific prior approval of the council of the city. That was the recommendation of the Finance Committee because, frankly, usually River Valley Transit in the city, we have had a couple of projects where we borrowed together. That last $2.5 million borrowing that included Bowman Field, half of that was RVT, right, Bill?
Yes.
Maybe 40%, maybe not half.
Yeah, it's 40, yeah, I think it was 40%. 40%, yeah.
So that is to say, we've definitely commingled borrowing with RVT in the past. But when we've done that, we have known specifically which parts belong to RVT in terms of repayment and which parts belong to the city. We borrowed $2.5 million, $1 million of it was for expenditures related to RVT, 1.5 was for expenditures related to the city.
And what we invested in next to the arena on
Right.
Lot E
Yeah.
is where we invested that money.
Exactly. But I guess my point is that we had a clear-cut idea of who was spending what and then who was responsible for the reimbursement on what. RVT is part of the city. Our feelings about whether or not maybe we should make them, I don't mean to like stick you out there like a stepchild or something, Bill. I'm just, I know that RVT is part of the city, but we have in general maintained relatively separate accounts and, all right, kind of. And so I am merely putting out to the rest of council that finance forwarded this with a positive recommendation, but I would make those observations, and they are observations I think to be taken seriously, that we open ourselves up to the potential of spending $2 million of borrowed money, and we need to make certain that we have a way to be aware that that is happening. We need, and I don't believe that this ordinance as currently structured necessarily accomplishes that.
Right.
So, and I don't want to be sitting here 2 years later, 2 years from now, when Mr. Nichols comes to me and asks me how much of the debt we'd like to retire, and I say all of it, and he says, well, we can't do that. So I'm just putting that out there, and I had opened it up for conversation.
Well, typically, thank you, we would, if I may, the, line of credit probably would be more narrow, but when we were able to, over the last 2 months, when the interest rates kept dropping, and they were able to lock it in, we pursued the idea of, making it not only as a line of credit, but then more of a possible long-term financing for these priority projects that are out there, whether it be the levee, Graffus Run, stormwater. I mean, there's just a lot of things out there that may need financing, and so the bank letting us lock this low rate in now for possible needs later on was a great opportunity that we didn't want to pass up. And I think the safeguards that are in there in terms of approval, if the long-term financing is needed or wanted for those decision makers at the time, I think is just the best of both worlds. So, I just think it's a nice tool to have in your back pocket if something would come up related to the levee or Grappus Run and there's a need for something out there. I don't know what it might be, but 2 years now is a lifetime, so I think it's a great tool for city leaders to have.
And I agree with Mr. Nichols, that's part of the problem. Sorry.
Mrs. Fonz?
I think very simply, in order for us to be able to accept like a RACB grant, if we want those grants, we have to have a
You
line
have
of
to,
credit.
yeah, that's-
I don't think it's a question of whether we should or we shouldn't. We must if we want that money to be able to do the things that we want to be able to do in the city. I also think it's important to look in the memo that we received that there's no prepayment penalty. So we won't wait 30 years to pay this. We'll pay it as soon as we can, but there's no penalty to that if we do pay it. And I think at a rate of 2.978%, you can't beat that, especially if it's locked in. And I feel really grateful to the bond council who was able to negotiate this along with Mr. Nichols and with Citizens Northern Bank. And I think it's a great agreement.
Other, yes.
If I can ask a quick question of Mr. Lubin, actually. Is there anything that I could insert? I mean, I know we have a codicil in there about anything using proceeds to finance River Valley Transit infrastructure or bus purchases. Could we potentially insert something else there that said something along the lines of any expenditures of note proceeds that are not specifically reimbursable expenditures?
If you want to limit it to that, but there may be something that comes up.
No, that's not what I'm saying is I want a notification clause. If we're utilizing proceeds from the note and we will not be reimbursed for them.
I think the language should be okay.
But the thing is, I guess the drawdown is not, okay. I'm just trying to, because we're drawing it all down here immediately, and then it's in another bank account, is the problem. So it's not, whatever we do with the drawdown is not really affecting where the money's going after it's borrowed. That's kind of the issue that I'm looking at.
Well, I can try to get language for you from Jens if you know, on second reading.
I guess what I'm saying, Mr. Nichols, is this particular note, we will at some point, probably in the next 6 months, draw down the entire 2 million. Maybe not, but we can't, it's not a revolving loan. So we're not putting money back in as we get it back. We're putting it into another account, right? And we're holding it in that other account until the 2-year period, at which point we're deciding how much of that money we are putting back into this account. But my fear is that what I don't want to do is get to the end of the 2-year drawdown period, and that other account only has $1 million in it, not the $2 million that we would need to fully, you know, and it's no longer an option for us to keep it, it's a requirement, you know. So, but I don't think that changing the language in the, related to the note is going to change any of that, because it's going to be in a separate account then.
Well, let's say you get to the end of the 2-year period, I see what you're saying, and if for some reason, maybe we're looking for the last reimbursement of $300,000, that's why when we were able to get to know prepayment penalty, that, so after the 2 years, then you come to council and say that, okay, we only want to term out $300,000 because here, this is still reimbursable, we might have to wait 6 more months.
Right.
So now you're into the 10-year term,
Right.
but without any prepayment, council's only authorized what is reimbursable
Right.
to keep going. So instead of having to renew a line of credit, this sort of gives us, it's almost the same thing as a line of credit because you can pay it off anytime, it's the same interest rate.
Yeah, yeah. No, I understand all of that. I'm simply asking does the administration have any thing that they can conceptualize that would, any restriction? You can ask Jens. What I would like for this council or future councils to know is if we are ever spending any portion of that funding for something that is not reimbursable.
Yeah, we can get it, that's fine.
Okay.
That's fine, whatever.
Right. I'm not saying that we object to it. I'm not saying that I may not be in a position where we say, okay, we need $250,000 to make $2 million happen at Graffius Run. Let's do it.
Well, I mean,
but I am saying that I would like to know when that happens.
If you,
know.
yeah, whatever,
If
if you
we're-
want to
if we're
approve it subject
using
to
bond
language
financing for-
addressing what you want to add, that's fine. I'm not sure I'm clear, but we can get it done, whatever you need.
Okay. I'm trying to make it as transparent as possible for us and therefore for the taxpayers. If the city
And
is
that's why I
taking on
agree.
more
That's why
debt.
we want to,
Right.
the council, every step of the way, needs to
Right.
approve what we're doing because, you know, what we crafted here is to respond to councils. We don't want to borrow we don't want to have to borrow any more money.
Right.
We really just want to have a line of credit. But we do have a lot of high priority projects we don't know how we're going to resolve. So, and there's going to be some new decision makers, and so, you know, with a low interest rate, you know, we want to give them a tool
Right.
that, you know, they just can't go out willy-nilly and spend it, but it's, you know, it's there, needed,
Yeah.
with council's approval.
Right. Okay.
Mr. Slaughter.
Couldn't we just amend it to say, you know, I mean, the one piece says any expenditures of note proceeds to finance River Valley Transit, et cetera. Couldn't we just say any expenditures of note, period, shall be subject to the specific prior approval of the council of this city?
One thing is that means also all the reimbursable ones, all the.
Well, I mean, then you would still know. I mean, we would know then whether it's reimbursable or not reimbursable. I mean, we just getting, because all you're saying is basically a
Right.
heads up.
Right, or at least, could we request from the finance department a report on it at the finance meeting, something like that?
Well,
where
that's what
council
we
can
usually do with the
come to
TAN, is when we draw down, we give you a report on that. Yeah.
Okay. Mr. Pavlik, would you be comfortable providing that to us on an expenditure basis? Yeah? Okay, all right, thank you. Oh, yeah.
Is there anything currently that we're going to use this for? Like,
Well, the East Third Street project, right now, we have state grants for Franklin Basin Street, which we need now to apply for reimbursement. So probably over the next 2-3 months, we would probably need $300,000 or $400,000 to, keep ahead of that reimbursement schedule. So I didn't want to wait any longer because the interest rates, and so waited as long as we thought that interest rates were going to keep going down, but we're into the project, so that's why I want to get it, because it takes 2 readings, and then the DCD has to be, you have to go through DCD and get the closing, and that takes another 30 days, so we're talking about 2 months, so that's why the timing is what it is, I guess. But again, we have time to add more language before the second reading, whatever you feel comfortable with.
and that 200,000 to 300,000, that would be the reimbursable piece for the East Third Street.
That's where we're at, and that's what we
Right,
need it for
right,
now, is
right.
East Third Street.
Reimbursable.
Well, Franklin Basin Street.
Mr. Henderson?
I would agree with Mr. Slaughter on that if we could amend that word, that verbiage, just to say any expenditure of the note be subject to, whether it's the approval of council or reported to the finance committee, something of that nature. But I think it just helps, especially because we know that there's going to be an entirely different council sitting here that is perhaps unaware of what we are doing today. And so just to keep it, keep them informed, I think it'd be great. So I would support that. I don't know exactly how, I don't know if Ms. Mealy, you have a thought on whether it should be with the approval of council as a whole or just the finance committee.
The only reason I said that we should limit it to the finance committee is so that we don't wind up in 45-minute discussions every time we need it, right? Or at least all of us don't wind up in 45-minute discussions.
Right. I mean, we can put in there something that reimbursement upon, that we're drawing down and provide that upon notification of finance committee and proper documentation. I mean, we do something like that.
Yeah.
Sure. Okay, so we can look for that on second reading then, I think is right.
We're always trying to catch up with the grants, and this is where the problem comes in. And at times, I think what we're trying to say here is that we don't know what grants are out there and where the money's going at times. I mean, I think we all feel that way when things are done, that we don't know the exact amount that's been paid out and when the grant has come in. Sometimes we just don't get that information. And I think, as they're all saying, with a new administration and new council, we really have to be on top of whatever's going on. Mr. Slaughter asked you about what else would this be used for. There are other grants that are out there, aren't there, that we're waiting for?
Right now, it would only be for, and that's why I asked Del to give me this memo. It's only for East Third Street and Bowman Field Rackby. That's it.
That's it?
Yeah, the language should be that we would not use it for anything else without approval.
Okay.
It's just for the 2 existing grants that have Rackby and PennDOT reimbursable type grants.
Memorial Park too, right?
Well, Memorial Park, because with that grant, we added that in there because with the grant approved, that's going to be a reimbursable 30, 60-day type thing. So again, given new decision making, depending on the timing, it may not be needed, depending on the timing, but.
And we currently have enough for Bowman Field right now, right?
What's that?
Currently, we have enough for Bowman Field, currently.
We're now,
with what
well,
we've
we're into
done.
the project now, so
Yeah.
maybe a couple months possibly. I mean, we're okay now.
Yeah, yeah. So we
We're
don't
okay
need,
now.
we don't need any of
We're
this
not gonna
right
draw it down
now for
unless we-
Bowman
no,
Field.
we
Right.
don't need it today, no.
Other comments? Questions? Yeah.
Just so that I'm clear, so that you'll bring just some changes.
We'll bring it to the
reflecting
finance
that.
committee and we'll
Okay.
go through, approve, have them approve it and
Yeah.
recommend if that's okay.
Thank you, I just wanted to
Yeah.
make sure there was a
Yeah.
plan of action.
Right.
So, thank you.
I think it makes a lot of sense.
Very good. Mrs. Frank on the motion, please.
Mrs. Fosna?
Yes.
Mr. Noviello?
Yes.
Mr. Henderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Katz?
Yes.
Mr. Slaughter?
Yes.
Ms. Mealy?
Yes.
Mr. Allison?
Yes. Motion passes. Thank you, Mrs. Frank. We will go to...
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Item 14, in short form, please. Mrs. Frank. Thank you, Mr. Nichols.
A resolution authorizing the execution of a municipal service agreement between the City of Williamsport and the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania Department of Transportation for maintenance of slopes along Miller's Run.
Is there a motion?
So move.
Second.
Motion and a second. Mr. Winder.
This resolution is basically a renewal. It's a 3-year agreement between the City of Williamsport and PennDOT for the maintenance of approximately 1,500 lineal feet of embankment along Miller's Run. The reimbursement over the 3 years would be a total of $10,756.33. It basically involves the flood control department mowing the grass in that area, cleaning up any limbs, debris, et cetera, things of that nature. As I said, it's just a renewal agreement. We do receive a 3% increase over each year of the agreement. It would go from September 1st, 2019 through September 1st, 2020. And this was reviewed by Public Works and passed with a positive, or Finance and passed with Public. Wait, I forget who reviewed it, I'm sorry.
I think it was finance.
Somebody liked it just
Yeah.
fine. This did come to the Finance Committee, and we forwarded it to the full body of council with a positive recommendation. Mr. Winder assured us that the funding from the Commonwealth covers not only the actual time that we, our employee time, staff hours spent on the mowing, but also depreciation of the equipment, fuel, all the other expenditures that one might contemplate in there. And of course, is graduated to allow for pay increases and inflation in general and costs, so.
So we're covered for our time and labor. Mrs. Katz.
We've got to really thank Adam for this. I mean, he went after this because we were doing this with getting no reimbursement for how long. And now we're getting the reimbursements, which is fantastic. So thank you.
Good job. Thank you. Other questions or comments? Mrs. Frank, on the motion, please.
Mrs. Fosna?
Yes.
Mr. Noviello?
Yes.
Mr. Henderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Katz?
Yes.
Mr. Slaughter?
Yes.
Ms. Mealy?
Yes.
Mr. Allison?
Yes, motion passes. Thank you, Mrs. Frank. Where are we? Item 16. In short form, please.
Resolution,
I think. Oh, 15, I'm sorry. I marked it.
resolution setting city council meetings for 2020.
No, I'm sorry, 15.
Yes, we need to
Okay.
do 15 first, sorry.
Resolution authorizing the city of Williamsport to award contracts for the city hall elevator and ADA access ramp.
And this is on the table. Is there a motion to take it off? Hearing none, it remains on the table. We'll move on to 16 now.
Resolution setting city council meetings for the year 2020.
Is there a motion?
So moved.
Second.
Motion and second. Mr. Lubin, welcome.
Good evening, Mr. President, members of council.
This is an annual resolution setting forth the council meetings for next year. If you notice that because there's a municipal election this year, we're required under the optional third-class city charter law to have the reorganizational meeting on the first Monday in January. And I believe the drafts of this were sent to all members of council, and any changes were made were at the request of various members of council.
Thank you, Mr. Lumen. Any discussion on this, council? Everybody good with these dates?
I just wanted to say, Randy, I believe you were one of the few people who had any real input and made a couple of changes in Bonnie, perhaps, on the one right before Thanksgiving. Thanks, guys.
Yes.
I'm never smart enough to pay enough attention to this, and then they come around and I think, man. So thank you for taking an interest and fixing things up. And thanks, Janice, for trying so hard to get us all engaged, even if it didn't work for me.
You're welcome.
It's a team effort. Mrs. Frank on the resolution, please.
Mrs. Fosna?
Yes.
Mr. Noviello?
Yes.
Mr. Henderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Katz?
Yes.
Mr. Slaughter?
Yes.
Ms. Mealy?
Yes.
Mr. Allison?
Yes. Motion passes. And thank you, Mrs. Frank. We will go to item 17. In short form, please.
A resolution to approve a Greenways Trail and Recreation Program grant agreement from the Commonwealth Financing Authority for the Memorial Park Playground Renovation Project.
Is there a motion?
So move.
Second?
Motion and a second. Mr. Pavlak.
Good evening. The resolution before you is to approve Greenways Trails and Recreation Program grant in the amount of $200,000. If you'll remember earlier this year, the council approved submitting a grant for $250,000. The $50,000 difference that we did not receive, what we're proposing is a fast track to this project, approving the grant at this meeting, at the next meeting, approving quotes for equipment, which will allow us to get a $65,000 grant from the vendor or a discount on the equipment cost, which will cover the difference in the amount that we will receive and still be able to do the original project that was proposed when the grant was submitted. So with that, included in the cover memo is the timeline or the key milestone dates that we'll need to follow in order to get everything to fall into place. With that, this was reviewed by Finance on Tuesday.
Thank you, Mr. Pavlak. And Finance.
This item was forwarded to the full body of council with a very positive recommendation. We're excited to get this park taken care of and back in play next year. And the equipment looks like it'll be exciting and add some new sort of interesting things to our playground areas. And I think the majority of our commentary related to how impressed we were with various members of the administration working. I believe Mr. Slaughter also was somewhat involved in the whole thing. But anyway, fast tracking this so that we can accept the grant, purchase the equipment, and take advantage of a $65,000 savings to the city, which is huge, by getting the whole thing taken care of before the end of October. We don't often move quite this quickly on grant funds, and so everyone who helped out, thank you very much. And I know it was Stephanie, Joan, Adam. I'm not sure who all else from the administration might have been involved, but this is great. And we do have the funding in place, as Mr. Pavlak says, and we'll continue, I think, to seek additional funding in case we can augment anything. So.
Thank you, Ms. Mealy. Ms.
I just
Foss.
want to thank Mr. Pavlak for his work on this piece of legislation. It's very important, and thank you for the last minute doing it and doing a great job.
Well, I want to pass on those thanks to Adam Winder, Sean Washington, Stephanie Young, and then previously with the grant being submitted, Penn Strategies and Jess Novinger.
Great. Thank you. Thank you to all those people.
Yes.
Yes.
No other comments? Mrs. Frank on the motion, please.
Mrs. Fosna?
Yes.
Mr. Noviello?
Yes.
Mr. Henderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Katz?
Yes.
Mr. Slaughter?
Yes.
Ms. Mealy?
Yes.
Mr. Allison.
Yes, motion passes. Thank you, Mrs. Frank. We're on item 18 then. In short form, please.
Resolution authorizing the sale of Rural Avenue, parcel number 74-004-200.
Thank you, Mrs. Frank. Mr. Nar.
Good evening again, President Allison and members of council. What we have before you tonight is a resolution requesting authorization to sell a parcel of land from the city. It's tax parcel 74004200. It is approximately 4,800 square feet grass space. It is at the intersection of Rural, Hollywood Circle, and Fifth Avenue. It is currently in the R1B zoning district. It is a non-conforming use. It isn't a developable property. It's too small for development. At this point in time, it did go through, I believe, Public Works and Finance as part of a package deal to sell other properties for the city. They have been removed. With them removing that, as far as to auction that, it's not feasible or cost-effective for the auctioneer to basically still auction this parcel off. So we were in discussions and spoke with Norm Lubin. The process would be to do an open bid to the highest bidder. If council does approve this property would basically, we would advertise, we would set a schedule as far as to open up the bids. Once the bids were to open up, it would come back before council for approval of the awarding of the contract. Council does have the ability to decline that award of the bid as well.
Thank you, Mr. Nar. The original proposals were reviewed, but not this particular one has just come to the full body of council, so I'll open it up for questions or comments. Mr. Noviello.
Can we start this with like a minimum bid, or how would that work?
Well, we discussed it with Norman, and again, it's appraised value of the property is $2,500. I believe anytime you exceed over $1,500, that's where you would go with that. So we can put a request as far as a minimum bid on that. Again, it is not a developable property. They can't build on it. There is one gentleman who is interested, and he owns the property adjacent to that. So I believe he will be at least one of the bidders for that parcel. He's just looking at combining that and adding it to his current home. But we can put a minimum bid on that.
Mr. Slaughter.
Yeah, I was just going to say, he contacted Nick Grimes to ask about this parcel.
I've been in discussion with him for several months, and again, he just wanted to know how he could do it, what he could do with the property, and then at that point, like I said, that's when he started to look at moving forward as far as how to do it.
Yep.
Mayor Campana.
Yes, I spoke to the gentleman probably at least 6-8 months ago that lives next door. My thinking right now is in regards to a minimum bid would be $500. And I want to get some feedback from council. I think there should be some type of minimum bid. For somebody to purchase it for $5 just wouldn't be prudent to the city. But most importantly, I think we have to remember this property will go on the tax rolls, and we won't have the nuisance of streets and parks having to shovel the walks and cut the grass, et cetera, and we can free Adam's department to do other things in the city. So that's what my thinking has been all along. Thank you.
Mr. Noviello.
I guess I might assume, without having any more knowledge, that the minimum bid would be $2,500.
If it's appraised,
What it seems to be appraised at.
I don't see that personally. I don't see that
Yeah.
working.
It actually costs the taxpayers more money to maintain that property a year than what it's worth. So just take that into consideration for what it's worth.
That is worth
It's completely out of the direction we move from one place to another, cut grass. We have to plow the sidewalks off. We have to go, weed whack. There's all these things we have to maintain with that property. By the time you add in manpower, hours, the equipment, wear and tear, all of that stuff, it is literally costing the taxpayers more money a year than the $2,500 that property's worth.
Interesting. So, thank you. Mr. Henderson.
I might mention also, once it's on the tax rolls, we'll be getting taxes from it every year.
Yeah.
So, that's something to consider.
When I, if I may, when I spoke to the gentleman several months ago, that live next door, his first question was, how much is my taxes are going to go up? So I think that's one of my concerns, that if we say you have to pay $2,500, this gentleman may say, it's not really worth it to me. My property's going to be reassessed. I may have to pay a little bit more. But I think there should be at least a minimum bid, and that's up to council to decide. Thank you.
Ms. Mealy?
Mr. Lubin, clarify for me, can't the city just sell something outright if we're selling it for less than $1,500?
If the property's been appraised for less than 1,500. Unfortunately, the appraisal came in above 1,500. That's something that Mr. Narr and I looked at, and also at one point with the fire chief.
That makes sense. I wasn't thinking about it. It wouldn't really be advantageous for us to be able to sell something for less than $1,500 if it was worth more than that. Okay.
Which it's an unrealistic figure, because real estate, you're not going to find anything less than, when they're talking about $1,500, it's an
Right.
unrealistic number.
A couple feet of sidewalks, about all you're going to get for under that, huh? Okay.
But unfortunately, that's what the code
That's
says.
what we have to do. Got it. Then, frankly, if we're establishing a minimum bid, my only major suggestion, it doesn't really seem at all advantageous just to hang on to this piece of property, would be that we make absolutely certain that we cover the staff time that we've got into the auction process and all that jazz, and the advertising costs, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
Other than that, I don't have a dog in this fight.
The
Mrs.
property, other than for the property that is next to it, nothing can be built on it, nothing can be
It is a
done with it.
non-conforming use within the R1B and is not developable and can't be used for anything.
So the only one who would want to probably purchase it would be the property that's on it
Correct.
or next to
Yep.
it.
And his
You need to know
indication
the
is,
neighbors are very pleased that it's been kept to look very nice the last couple of years. They've talked to me about that, and I don't see it being sold for anything other than the person that lives next to it.
Mr. Henderson?
Also, I think we ought to mention that he is a taxpayer,
Yeah.
and we want to treat him well, and so, I don't think it would be prudent for us to try to get out of anyone, especially our taxpayers, as much as we can. I'm not sure it's good for us.
I think Mr. Winder's comments addressing how much it costs the city to maintain that carry the day for me, that it's prudent that we go through with the bid, and I think discussing minimum bid or whatever is probably not really going to go anywhere. Who was, okay, Ms. Mealy.
My only question was, I believe that we're all assuming right now that there will be only one bidder.
And there may be
Right.
one.
and again,
And I don't
but
see it-
legally, we do have to advertise it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep, so-
Right, and so my question is, the bizarre question of, how does the process, if there were more than two bidders, it would be the higher bidder, correct? There's not a bidding process that happens, like a live bidding process.
And this would be.
It's like a
would
Chinese auction, right?
be like the highest bidder.
Yeah. So basically,
Basically, what
we
we-
get envelopes.
Well, what the process of it will be is, providing council passes this resolution, I'll get with Norm, we will do a public advertisement, we will set a schedule of when we have the closing of the bids. Once we do that, we'll have basically opening of the bids here in city council. Once we open the bids, determine the highest bidder, at that point, we'll reach out to council, bring it back to council, because council is required by ordinance to award the contract.
Understood. But I guess what I'm saying is there would never be an opportunity, should there happen to be two bids, for someone to say, oh, now I'll bid more. It doesn't work that way, correct?
closed- it'll be a closed
right,
bids.
Yep, exactly. Okay.
But we should put a minimum bid on this, right? Should it be in the resolution?
We haven't, I don't think we've decided that yet, but we can,
I mean,
I've heard different things. But
I think a minimum bid should be put on this.
It sounded as though it was the recommendation of the administration to make the minimum bid $500, correct?
I think that's basically would be a comment, and again, what that is if nothing else, it would recover our advertising costs.
Got it.
I think that's what we should do.
Okay.
Should that be part of the motion?
Is there, we would have to,
Motion to amend the.
we would have to amend it. Is there a motion to
I
amend?
make a motion to amend the resolution that a minimum bid of $500 be a part of the advertisement.
Second.
There's a motion and a second. Further discussion on minimum bids?
Just let all of us bear in mind that we can reject whatever bid we get.
Correct.
Right.
So establishing a minimum bid doesn't, you know what I mean, in some ways runs counter to the whole idea of being able to reject whatever bid we get, if we want to. But either way is fine.
Other questions on the amendment? Mrs. Frank on the amendment, please.
Mrs. Spasna.
Yes.
Mr. Noviello.
Yes.
Mr. Henderson.
Yes.
Mrs. Katz.
Yes.
Mr. Slaughter.
Yes.
Ms. Mealy.
Yes.
Mr. Allison.
Yes. Motion to amend to minimum bid, $500 passes. Now we're back to the resolution itself. Do we have more discussion on that? See none on the resolution itself. Mrs. Frank, please.
Mrs. Spasna.
Yes.
Mr. Noviello.
Yes.
Mr. Henderson.
Yes.
Mrs. Katz.
Yes.
Mr. Slaughter.
Yes.
Ms. Mealy.
Yes.
Mr. Allison.
Yes. Motion passes. Thank you, Mrs. Frank. I believe we've covered all of the work items. Item 21, except for filing, public safety minutes of June 18, 2019, Controller's Report of July 2019, Planning Commission minutes of September 30th, 2019. Is there a motion?
So moved.
And a second?
Second.
Motion and a second. Comments? Hearing none. Mrs. Frank, please.
Mrs. Spasna.
Yes.
Mr. Noviello.
Yes.
Mr. Henderson.
Yes.
Mrs. Katz.
Yes.
Mr. Slaughter.
Yes.
Ms. Mealy.
Yes.
Mr. Allison.
Yes, motion passes. Thank you, Mrs. Frank. Item 22, announcements. The next regularly scheduled city council meeting will be on Thursday, October 24th, right here at 7:30 p.m. Upcoming meetings, Monday, October 14th at 12 noon, Planning Commission, 4 p.m. Recreation. Tuesday, October 15th, 10 a.m. Blighted Property, 3:30 p.m. ERC, 6:30 p.m. HARB. Thursday, October 17th, 10:30 a.m. Zoning Hearing Board, 4 p.m. Board of Health. Tuesday, October 22nd, 11 a.m. Historical Preservation, 1 p.m. Finance Committee, 2:30 p.m. Public Works, 3:30 p.m. Public Safety. Wednesday, October 23rd, 11:30 a.m., Redevelopment Authority. And that's it for announcements. Comments from Peanut Gallery? No, from council tonight.
Hey, I'm a hazelnut.
None. Council, comments from the administration? No comments. From the public? Mr. Keller?
Good evening, Ralph Keller, 203 U Street. I'd like to comment about this whole Franklin Street naming. Since this is in my backyard, basically, and I drive these streets all the time, I'd like to have my 2 cents. I think you've done the correct thing to table this and take it back. I think a hodgepodge would be inappropriate. And if you take that short section of Franklin that's been reconstructed, which is a half block, a few hundred feet, and give it a different name, I think it would just be plain stupid, to say nothing of confusing. I think Franklin Street should remain Franklin. Basin should be remaining as Basin. I agree with Mr. Huffman, but I also like Mr. Henderson's proposal to give it an honorary name and keep the book names as they were. Some of you may be old enough to think back on Hebron Street, when that was redeveloped, where that street is curved between the Genetti parking lot and the plaza. It used to be a 2-lane straight street. They put that curve in when they redeveloped it. Well, they put a curve in, they didn't change the name where the curve is,
I think the same thing with Franklin Street. Why rename a curved section just because it was curved? Franklin Street terminated at East 4th. And as far as honoring names, you've done that for Mrs. Whaley. Matter of fact, I think the portion of Erie Avenue is Memorial. I think that is also honoring Dr. King. There's other streets in the city that have a secondary honorary name. So I think those are things that could be looked at, and I don't think you should come up with a hodgepodge of things. Just one last comment to Mrs. Fosnet's comment. Please get in your cars, drive west on the Beltway, get off at Basin Street, something I do very frequently, and at the foot of the hill at Basin Street, you'll find a big sign, big letters, Lycoming College with an arrow. I think that solves the problem of how you get to Lycoming College. I don't know if PennDOT put it there or the city, and actually I think it points you up to the Mulberry Street roundabout and takes you in the Mulberry Street entrance. But I think that would be a lot more friendly and easier for people to, that are from out of town, to find their way to the college than just changing a street name. Thank you.
Mr. Huffman.
I'd just like to thank you again for reconsidering the Franklin Street, Basin Street issues. I would just simply ask if there's going to be more discussion with the college, with the city, that it be done at a public meeting. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, Joanne Clementoni from Chestnut Street. I'd just like to say thank you very much to the Streets Department for coming and fixing the potholes and doing a beautiful job. They really did a great job today. And it's going to stay that way and hopefully nice until spring, until the street can really be fixed properly. But I really appreciate it. They did a great, great job. Thank you.
Thank you for coming back and sharing that. And, no other comments from the public tonight, so I'll entertain a motion for adjournment.
So moved.
Second.
We're adjourned.
All in favor?
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.